morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. For those of you who are new to politics in the time of coronavirus, we'll be taking questions in about 30 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. And as always, she'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So Dan, it's time for me to introduce you as if you need introduction on your wonderful weekly program and talk about your 3 topics for today. How are you?
I'm great, Kim. How are you doing?
Lack of news, Dan, lack of news. So I have 3 terrific topics for our audiences today. Bipartisanship or bust. Can Biden cut a COVID deal with Congress? The China challenge. A new president faces old challenges. And a topic that came up from last week that you're addressing, when can we get America's students back into the classroom? So without further ado, let you take this away because we want as much time with you as possible. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Kim. And I should say that not only our schools topic, but our focus on China too, comes from feedback provided directly by all of those of you who join us each week. So thank you very much for your guidance, and we always appreciate it when you fill out the reviews of the session and when you offer suggestions of topics for us to cover in the future, because we really do try to put these programs together with topics that are going to be of most interest and relevance to all of you. So topic 1, and that's the COVID negotiations. Last night, President Biden met with 10 Republican senators to discuss the compromise proposal they'd offered over the weekend in response to his COVID relief package. Now, before we go any further on this, I would like to check the temperature of this group on how Biden should proceed, given that he's been talking a lot about bipartisanship over the months, and now it looks like the Republicans are calling him out on it. So Claire, let's put up our first question right away for the group and see what all of you think. So should Biden be willing to compromise with Republicans on the COVID relief legislation? Yes, it's important to demonstrate bipartisanship, or no, the legislation is too important to reduce the amount of spending or to slow down the process at all. There's apparently a debate going on among Biden's advisors on whether to try to accommodate the Republicans to some degree, or alternatively to point to public opinion polling showing very broad support among Democrats and independents and a large plurality of Republicans for the proposal. So Claire, let's see what our group thinks before we get started on this discussion. It's a pretty close divide, closer than I would have expected. 55%, just a little bit more than half of you, say that it's important to demonstrate bipartisanship and that he should be willing to compromise with the Republicans. And 45%, a little bit less than half, but again, a pretty close division here, says that no, this is really too important and Biden needs to move forward with or without the Republicans. So of course, this is the president's first major legislative effort since taking office. And I think you'd agree with me, it's hard to believe. It's been less than 2 weeks since Joe Biden was sworn in as president. It seems like much, much longer. But so, of course, this is his first and his most important legislative work. And there's money in this package, about $1.9 trillion in the Biden proposal for vaccinations, for direct stimulus payments to families and to small businesses, for unemployment benefits, and a number of other provisions designed to either protect or support a lot of Americans who've been harmed by the pandemic. Now, as we discussed last week, congressional Democrats are preparing to move the bill forward on a straight party line vote through the reconciliation process without any Republican support at all. Just as a reminder, it takes 60 votes to move a bill through the Senate in order to cut off debate. And so the importance of the fact that there are 10 Republican senators who came to the White House yesterday to meet with Biden and Vice President Harris is critical, because those 10 Republicans plus the 50 Democrats could get to that 60 threshold if Biden decided to move forward in a bipartisan manner. But of course, Democrats can move this bill with 51 votes. And West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, probably almost certainly the most conservative member of the Democratic Senate caucus, announced this morning that he would support going ahead with Biden's package. So if Biden wants to, he doesn't need any Republican votes at all. But at least this group thinks it would make some sense for him to go after them. Now, Republicans have been reminding us that Biden has called for bipartisan unity as a candidate for the better part of a year, and now as president. And so their legislative proposal, they put out their own legislative proposal. That's what they met with the president about yesterday. But it's important to know that while Biden's package sets aside roughly, like I said, $1.9 trillion, almost $2 trillion, the Republican proposal is about 1/3 of that, a little bit over $600 million. So the president took them up on their request, and it's been reported they had a very pleasant meeting, but one without any apparent movement on either side. And meanwhile, the clock is ticking. If a bill isn't moving forward before the Senate begins its impeachment trial of former President Trump, which starts a week from today, it's going to be very difficult to get that bill passed before unemployment benefits start running out for millions of Americans next month. So there's not a lot of time here. And that leaves Biden with a fundamental question, the one which all of you provided advice on a minute ago. So what does Biden do? Does bipartisanship mean compromising in a substantive fashion with the other party? Or alternatively, does bipartisanship just mean meeting with the other side and hearing them out in a collegial way? And we'll find out the answer to that question in the next several days. Now, the stakes are immense. I talked about the disparity between the funding levels, $1.9 trillion for Biden's plan, just over $600 billion for the Republicans' proposal. The Democrats say that $600 billion isn't nearly enough, and they want to move forward with a party line vote. The Republicans have responded by saying that there's still hundreds of billions of dollars from the previous COVID relief packages, including the one that passed just in December, that haven't been spent yet. And their argument is, let's use the money we've already allocated before going on to the next level. Now, the two proposals are very similar, almost identical, on the amount spent on the vaccination process. And without getting too far into the details, it looks like there's room for compromise on the size of the stimulus checks and the length of the extension of unemployment benefits. The really big differences between Biden's proposal and the Republicans are on money for state and local government and on the president's proposal to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Like I said, the impeachment trial starts 1 week from today, so that doesn't leave a lot of time for them to get this done. Question for all of you: what do you think is going to happen? What do you predict will be the outcome of this? Will Biden go forward with the with the Democratic plan, $1.9 trillion in its entirety? Will he agree to the Republican proposal, $600 billion? Or, and let's look at these options carefully, is it somewhere in between? Will the agreement be somewhere closer to the Republican plan, maybe between $600 billion and $1 trillion? Will it be closer to the Democratic plan, a little bit of compromise, but not that much, $1.5 trillion to $1.9 trillion? Or do you think they'll split the difference pretty evenly with a package of between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion? So the question is Biden or are the Republicans going to get everything they want? Or if they do compromise, who gets the better end of the deal? Or do they really split it right down the middle? So sort of a complicated question, but of course we have a smart group here. So Claire, let's see what the solutions are. Look at that. Only 8% think that the Biden plan of $1.9 trillion will become law. No one thinks the Republican proposal will become law. Only 6% say it'll lean toward the Republicans. 48% think Biden will do some compromising, but won't be willing to come halfway. Almost half of you think that Biden gets not everything he wants, but most of what he wants. And I think the benefit of that, of course, is he does come out looking more bipartisan. And 38%, a slightly smaller number, think it'll be a pretty even compromise. So the sentiment seems to be that Biden gives up something, but not a lot. In my own opinion, for what it's worth, is, at least politically speaking, as opposed to the substance of the plan, That's probably the smartest thing for Biden to do because Biden wants to be a bipartisan president. He also wants to be a president to beat back the pandemic. And there might still be a sweet spot that allows him to be both of those things. And I think what the plurality of you identified is probably somewhere around what that sweet spot is. But either way, if the possibility of a compromise is still there, he's going to need to find it very quickly. Let's move on and let's talk about China. Because last week, when we asked you what you thought that the Biden administration's top foreign policy priorities ought to be, you made it very clear that China was number one. And it appears from the first 13 days of this administration that the White House seems to agree with you. And of course, that was even before the emerging events in Myanmar over the last day or so. And I think, as most of you know, that critically important country, important in its own right, is really, really seminal for geopolitical reasons because it sits right in between China and India. But let's talk about China specifically for just a few minutes. Just in the first days of his administration, the Biden White House has already invited Taiwan's top Washington representative to attend Biden's inauguration. And that's never happened before. This is the functional equivalent of the Taiwanese ambassador to Washington. And Biden is the first president ever to invite the person holding that role to his inaugural, which did not sit well with Beijing. The Biden administration has already made it clear that they agreed with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's designation of China's actions in Northwest China as representing genocide. And third, when China engaged in military exercises in the South China Sea immediately after Biden's inauguration, the administration sent an aircraft group led by the aircraft carrier, the USS Teddy Roosevelt, into the South China Sea. So all three very forceful actions against China just in Biden's first days in office. But I will tell you that as visible as all of those were and as impactful as all of those actions were, as to Biden's intentions going forward, there was something else that got somewhat less attention that I think was even more important, letting the Chinese know how serious Biden takes this challenge. John Kerry, the former senator and Secretary of State who's been designated as the Biden administration's envoy for climate change, gave a speech last week in which he made it clear that while the US is intent on cooperating with China on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, Kerry made it clear that the US will not compromise on economic or security or human rights priorities in exchange for environmental action. So think about this for a second. It's one thing for the Biden administration to say, hey, climate change is important when we want to work with the climate and we want to work with China on it. That's just fine. But that statement didn't come from the Secretary of State. It didn't come from the Secretary of Defense. It came from the individual who President Biden has designated to lead his global climate change efforts. And if John Kerry is saying, we want to work with you on climate change, but not at the cost of these other imperatives, that's a pretty strong statement that I imagine resonated very, very clearly amongst the Chinese government leadership. Making it clear that climate change will be decoupled from these other policies is a very, very big deal. It's a message to China from Biden that as important as climate change is to the United States, China's leaders shouldn't look at this issue as a way to gain concessions on other fronts. Now, the most stark geopolitical impact of the Trump administration on our country's foreign policy going forward is almost certainly a much less trusting and much more aggressive approach to dealings with China. There's a lot of things that Trump did on the world stage over the last 4 years that Biden is looking to walk back or reverse, but this is not one of them. And there's widespread support in both parties, bipartisan consensus for a new attitude toward China. And the Biden administration does, as we talked about a minute ago, look like they're prepared to continue in this direction. Well, there's no question that President Biden is going to carry out diplomacy in a more conventional manner than his predecessor. It looks like he's willing to get tough with China too. So the question for all of you is, what do you think? How would you compare Biden's likely approach to China with that of Donald Trump? Do you think Biden will be tougher than Trump on China, more forceful and more aggressive? Do you think he'll be more accommodating, not as tough as Trump? Or do you think he'll be roughly the same level? Let's see what we've got here, Claire, from our group. Interesting. Most of you, a pretty strong plurality, say that it'll be about the same. More than a third, 37%, believe that Biden will be more forceful and tougher than Trump on China. And 20% say not as tough and more accommodating. And one of the things we'll have to talk about in the weeks ahead is whether Biden's approach, regardless of the level of toughness, will be more effective or not than Trump's. And there'll be a couple of variables, I think, for us to consider as we continue to have that conversation about this critical challenge for Biden and for our country. I would argue that the challenge for the United States and China is less international and more personal. Let me explain. The Chinese president, President Xi, is that country's 7th leader since Mao. But he's the first Chinese leader since Mao to cast the relationship between the two countries in such confrontational terms. His predecessors worked very hard to establish China on the world stage, but Xi seems to be the only one who looks at it, who looks at China's role in a more aggressive and potentially combative way to the United States. There's two types of world powers. There are status quo powers who want to strengthen their country's role in the existing world order. And then there are revisionist powers. And revisionist powers want to fundamentally remake that world order. And I'd argue that China is the planet's first revisionist power since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I don't know how clear it is that Xi's approach is supported within the Chinese government to the extent that his appointees want to be as aggressive going forward as he does. For right now, because of the very heavy-handed approach that Xi has on not just on his government, but on Chinese society, support for his approach is very, very strong. But the United States' long-term challenge, not just under Joe Biden, but under his successors of both parties, ought to be to identify potentially reluctant supporters of Xi, who might lose enthusiasm for his strategy as China confronts upcoming economic and demographic challenges. This is ultimately how the United States won the Cold War with the Soviet Union. George Kennan, the famous State Department diplomat, wrote what was called the Long Memo in the late 1940s, outlining a path forward. And it's beginning to appear that the same kind of path, aggression when it's necessary, cooperation when it's appropriate, but searching for potential weak links within the other country's leadership, does look like Biden and the people who succeed him in office have a template from which to work. In the meantime, that's pretty long-term stuff. In the meantime, Biden's plan is to rebuild U.S. relationships on the Pacific Rim and to enlist European support to help balance China's aggression. So as we've talked about several times before, multilateralism is back. Trump preferred a one-on-one approach to most of his diplomatic and foreign relations endeavors. Biden has made it very clear, both in words and throughout his career, that he believes a multilateral approach makes more sense. And we're going to see in the days ahead, as the United States and its allies try to figure out how to respond to the coup in Myanmar, we'll see if that Biden brand of multilateralism is successful, because it's about to get a road test. So third and finally, let's go on to our last question for the day. And that question is, when are the schools going to open up again? Now, candidate Joe Biden made it very clear in his campaign and since his election, he promised to reopen most public schools within 100 days of taking office. And it's worth noting that his administration has very quietly walked back a little bit on that promise. Because originally Biden was talking about opening up schools K through 12. Now he's talking about kindergarten through 8th grade, which is a tacit admission that this is going to be much, much harder than it looks. Now he appointed a Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, who opened most of the schools in Connecticut. But right now, duplicating that effort on a national scale looks like a very, very difficult challenge. I mean, for a lot of us, particularly for those of you who have parents who have children in the schools, it feels like the schools are the only things that are still closed. Yeah, we can go to restaurants, again, albeit for outside dining. Many parents choose to send their children to private school so they can learn in person. We can shop indoors at malls and most other types of establishments. We can get together with friends for coffee and go to the farmer's market, get a parking ticket and pay a parking ticket, and do just about anything else we want, as long as you wear a mask and you follow social distance guidelines. But if you're a kid, you can't go to public school. And the number of children here in California and across the country who are failing classes, particularly children from minority and underrepresented communities, has skyrocketed, as of the number who simply stopped showing up at all for online learning. Now, the Center for Disease Control released a study last week that found that the risk of COVID transmissions in the classroom is pretty minimal, as long as it's paired with precautions like mask wearing and social distancing. But teachers are reluctant to return to the classroom until their health and safety can be assured. And that's already led to a huge fight here in California and a brewing one in Washington too. Now, here in California, Governor Newsom set a February 1st deadline for schools to sign on for his proposed reopening. February 1st, of course, was yesterday, and not a single school district in the entire state of California signed on to the governor's plan. None. And just last night, the superintendent of the LA Unified School District, Austin Buettner, blasted Newsom for the flaws in his plan in pretty harsh language for someone who's been a longtime ally. And I have to admit that neither Governor Newsom nor Superintendent Buettner sound like the schools are going to reopen anytime soon. So let me ask you what you think. And so, Claire, if we can put up the fourth question. When do you think public schools are going to open again? And let's use President Biden's definition for reopening, framing it as a kindergarten through 8th grade reopening, as opposed to kindergarten through high school. Do you think the schools will be open again by April of this year? In other words, by Joe Biden's 100-day commitment? Do you think the schools will be open in August this year, in time for the fall semester to start the new school year? Do you think it'll be another year? Do you think we'll be waiting until next spring semester, January of next year, for the schools to reopen? Or do you think it'll be further in the future, even beyond next year, before most public schools, kindergarten through 8, reopen? And what do we have for responses? Oh, really interesting. A little bit less than a quarter, 21% of you think that the president's going to be able to fulfill his commitment to get most public schools open, 21%. 70% think it'll be the new school year come August. And only 7% say next January, and 1% say further in the future. So not a lot of pessimists in our room, but we'll call this measured optimism. And we'll see as Biden goes forward whether this is something he'll be able to pull off despite our expectations. Now, the politics of this, the politics of school reopening, are incredibly complicated for both Biden and for Newsom. The strongest opponents to a faster reopening are the teachers' unions, and they're emphasizing the need to protect teachers from the virus. But we have a growing number of parents, especially from those minority and underrepresented communities, who are seeing a disproportionate impact that distance learning is having on their children. Those parents are getting increasingly frustrated. Now, both Biden and Newsom have very strong ties to the teachers' unions. Newsom is going to need the union's support to fend off a possible recall campaign, which may end up qualifying against him. And new polling out just this morning from the Institute of Government Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, show that Californians really have soured on Governor Newsom's handling of the crisis. And Biden, it's worth noting, might be the first true teachers union ally in the Oval Office since Jimmy Carter. You know, since Carter left the presidency roughly 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, of course, all served as president and were no friends or fans of the teachers unions. But even Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, the two Democratic presidents who've served since then. And of course, Donald Trump had no love for the unions, and the unions had no love for him. But even Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, the two Democratic presidents who've served since Carter, both tended to identify more with the education reform camp, whereas Biden has been a very, very strong ally of the teachers unions throughout his entire career in public service. So on one hand, he is a Secretary of Education who has a record for pushing hard to reopen the schools. On the other hand, one of the greatest challenges for the president and for the governor as well is how to do that in the face of resistance from such a longtime ally. And although I hate to make predictions, as all of you know, one that I will make is this fight between the unions and parents is going to get worse before it gets better. So with that, we're just coming up on the bottom of the hour. And so Jessica, if you'd be willing to join me, let's move on to my favorite part of each week's program, when we start hearing questions from our smart viewers and listeners. How are the questions?
We got a lot of questions, so we'll dive right in. Why do Republicans stick by not wanting to give any money to cities and states, even though layoffs of government workers are likely?
So there's two reasons that Republicans have argued that including state and local funding in this package doesn't make sense. One, as I mentioned earlier, is they point out that there's been large sums of money allocated in previous COVID relief legislative packages that have not yet been spent. The most recent being December, but even those bills that passed last spring and summer, there's still some money left. And what the Republicans are saying is let's spend that money first before allocating more, and we'll have a better idea for where and when it would be most useful. The other point, which is a very, very interesting one, is we've talked a lot over the months, as all of you know, about the so-called K-shaped recovery. The idea that people who can work from home, better educated workers, more prosperous workers, are actually doing very well. But it's working class Americans, those essential workers who do have to go outside of their homes to do their jobs, who've really suffered most economically. What that's meant here in California, but elsewhere around the country, is tax revenues coming in for state budgets are much higher than expected, because the higher earning individuals who pay the highest percentage of state taxes are still doing pretty well financially. So there've been a couple of analyses done that show, if you look at all 50 states, that state level tax receipts are down from a year ago, from 2019, but only very, very slightly. And so the Republicans' other argument is, while we acknowledge that we are going to need to spend more to help state and local government going forward, it's worth noting that their tax revenues are actually doing pretty well. So let's take the time and see the impact of the money we've already allocated that hasn't been spent before going for more. And if our group is right, Jessica, and they think that Biden is going to compromise, but not immensely with the Republicans, I think that's one area in which he might concede a little bit, not because he feels that money for local and state government isn't important, but because he has already indicated his interest in following up with a much broader Build Back plan to come out later this spring. And if they can use money from the December legislative agreement and the bills passed last summer to help fund state and local government for the time being, then by the time Biden is ready to move forward with his bigger ticket item, then maybe that's where the rest of state and local government funding comes from.
Thank you. This is a bit of a follow-up to what you just said. So given the CBO's estimate that the economy will rebound without a financial package, does the package need to be as large as Biden is asking?
Well, the Republicans say no, and some more moderate Democrats don't think it needs to be this large either. Although Senator Manchin announced this morning that he would support the package, he's indicated that he'd still like to see it trimmed back. In other more moderate Democrats, Senators Sinema and Kelly from Arizona, Senator Tester from Montana, and others have made similar noises. I think the question is where the money goes, and there is almost total agreement between Biden and the Republicans on the need to fully fund the vaccination process. Where the differences exist, as the previous questioner noted, is on state and local funding, and on questions that many Republicans feel are ancillary to the COVID relief package, such as the president's proposal to raise the minimum wage. And even some of Biden's own advisors apparently are telling the president that while they don't want to compromise too much, they do believe that the level of stimulus checks that's being proposed in the bill might be somewhat better targeted. So in other words, higher income Americans who might, under Biden's proposal, be getting a stimulus check would not, in order to focus the spending more specifically on working class Americans and others who are really in need.
This next questioner says, trying to get bipartisan support didn't do Dems any good when Obama tried to get the stimulus package through. He compromised and went with a lower amount. The compromise was led by Susan Collins. Because of the compromise, experts say it took 4 to 5 years longer to get us out of the Great Recession. Isn't it true we're more at risk having it be too low versus too high?
And this is the argument that the president and his advisors are making, because not only Joe Biden, but many of the people around him were working in the Obama administration when then President Obama cut that deal on economic relief in 2009, shortly after taking office. The counter to that, not from Republicans, but within the Biden administration, is a lot of the president's advisors and a lot of outside observers as well believe that Joe Biden is frankly a better negotiator than Barack Obama. And there was no shortage of times over Obama's 8 years in office when he turned to Biden to negotiate legislative agreements and compromises with Republicans in Congress, because Obama was not able to pull it off. And so yesterday, Biden, it's worth noting, sat down with those 10 Republicans before he had face-to-face meetings with any Democratic congressional members. So on one hand, you do have a Biden administration that is very, very aware of the dynamic that occurred in 2009, as the questioner mentioned. On the other hand, it seems like they've got enough faith in their guy to think that negotiations can bring back a better, can result in a better outcome now than was the case 12 years ago.
We have 2 questions on the minimum wage. So the first one is, please explain what can be included in reconciliation. Can it include the $15 minimum wage? And then I'll do a follow-up after that answer.
Oh my gosh, I will do my best, but there is no clear answer to this question. So a couple of things. As you've heard me talk about before, and as I'm sure most of you have read and heard elsewhere, that while it generally takes 60 votes to pass a bill in the Senate in order to cut off debate, that this so-called reconciliation process allows legislation that is directly related to the budget and taxes to pass with a majority of 51 votes rather than 60, which of course would allow Biden to pass his COVID relief bill with only Democratic votes, having Vice President Harris on hand to break the tie. So one of the arguments going on right now, as the questioner correctly noted, is that in addition to the money for COVID relief, for unemployment benefits, for direct payments, and so on, can a proposed increase in the minimum wage be accomplished under reconciliation? And the question, therefore, is, does raising the minimum wage, is that action directly related to budget and taxation questions? Most observers, not all, but most observers think that it's a bit of a reach, that that's really not something that would be allowed under reconciliation. However, some of the strongest supporters of a minimum wage increase, led by Senator Sanders, are saying that in fact it can take place under reconciliation. The honest answer is we don't know. When the late Robert Byrd was Senate Majority Leader, he imposed some very specific restrictions called the Byrd Rules on what could be included in a budget reconciliation bill and what couldn't. And under Byrd's very strict restrictions, the minimum wage would not be able to be included. Sanders and many other Democrats feel otherwise. Ultimately, this is a decision that would be made by the Senate parliamentarian. And we obviously don't know how that decision is going to go yet. So most observers think that including the minimum wage in a 51-vote bill would be challenged, but there are some strong voices and some smart people who feel otherwise. Depending on how Biden's negotiations with Republicans go, we'll find out within the next few weeks whether it can happen or not. Long-winded way of saying we have no idea yet.
That's fair. The other question on the minimum wage was, would not an increase in the minimum wage just raise prices of goods and services? Would there really be a net gain to lower paid workers?
Well, that's the argument against from those who are against raising the minimum wage. They believe it will lead to the businesses that employ minimum wage workers to raising their prices and having an impact on the consumer. Proponents, supporters of a minimum wage increase, including President Biden, point out that the minimum wage has not been increased in many, many years. And what Biden himself has said on any number of occasions is if somebody works full-time in a job for a 40-hour week, they ought to make enough money that a full-time job would lift them above the poverty level, and the current minimum wage would not. So the questioner's argument is one that's part of this debate, and will probably ultimately impact whether minimum wage is included as part of a reconciliation bill or not. My gut, and it's just a gut, is the minimum wage probably waits until Biden's larger package later this spring, but I don't say that with any confidence, or at least not with much confidence.
Question, what are the factors which dictate the amount of money, $2,000, of the stimulus checks? How was the $2,000 decided upon? What is the likelihood that these economic stimulus checks will be recurring?
Well, once again, this says these are questions that haven't yet been resolved. When the two parties were negotiating back in December, the Democratic proposal was for a $2,000 package, a $2,000 stimulus check, the argument being that it would require that much money in order to help families in need. Because the compromise in December resulted in a $600 sum, a lot of people now in Congress are saying, well, let's include the other $1,400 in this proposal. I'm not an economist, so I'm not in a position to tell you what the magic figure is for how much is going to help families in need to the greatest degree. On one hand, the more money you give people, the more money they will have to spend. And you can argue that that's good not only for their own sustenance, but for the economy, if they do have the resources to spend. The counter argument from many Republicans and some Democrats and some Biden administration officials is that stimulus is just fine, but let's target it more narrowly. So instead of sending stimulus checks to people who are very economically successful, even during the pandemic, let's target those resources to lower income and to working class Americans. That way they can get what they really need, and ultimately it's less of a burden on the Treasury. There are some more progressive Democrats who've argued that these stimulus checks ought to continue on a very extended basis, even post-pandemic. But since right now we really don't have any idea what post-pandemic means, I suspect that's an argument that's not going to be resolved for several months.
We had two questioners ask, why has the money from the prior COVID bills not been spent yet? And why haven't the excess funds been utilized?
Well, government doesn't move quickly. And these are extraordinary sums of money. And as we've seen here in California, that when they're spent too quickly, a lot of that money can end up in the wrong hands. And actually, to be fair, we've seen that both in California and at the national level. A lot of the money for small businesses that was allocated on a very hurried basis last spring and summer ended up going to very large corporations and to other businesses that didn't need it. Here in California, we have a huge scandal, well north of $10 billion of money, of state unemployment money being given to fraudulent applicants. And so on one hand, you want to move as quickly as possible to get this money out the door. On the other hand, you want to make sure that it's spent carefully and appropriately. And so while some of that money can get into the hands of families and small businesses very quickly, other takes more. And when you're dealing with several levels of government, federal and state and local governments all trying to intersect with each other and figure out the most efficient way to interact, it does tend to slow down. It does tend to slow down the process. So the phrase you hear most frequently is that the money is in the pipeline. And on one hand, that's a good thing because it means the Congress and the president have agreed to allocate these sums for necessary projects or hopefully necessary projects. But in the pipeline means it hasn't arrived at its destination yet. And the Republican argument, as we talked about earlier, for a lower package is to let the rest of that money get to its destination before spending a lot more. What the Democrats would say in response to that is if the money gets out the door so slowly and goes through the pipeline so slowly, let's allocate it now so it can get where it needs to be sooner rather than later.
Before we pivot from DC to China questions, we had several people asking about Marjorie Taylor Greene. So what is Marjorie Greene's goal in making outrageous statements she must know are false? And if you can just comment on the status of her.
Well, to me, what's much more interesting than Representative Taylor Greene herself is the dilemma she presents to the Republican Party. And just as Senator McConnell and House Minority Leader McCarthy voiced very, very different thoughts as it related to Trump's challenge to the election, they're approaching this question of Taylor Greene's statements in a very, very different way also. McConnell, as is often the case, represents the more traditional conservative brand of the Republican Party, what I call pre-Trump Republicans. And he last night, without naming Representative Taylor Greene, denounced her in just scathing terms and made it clear that as far as he was concerned, that she had no place in the Republican Party whatsoever. Kevin McCarthy, on the other hand, because his responsibility are House seats rather than Senate seats, has been more accommodating with President Trump than McConnell, who hasn't spoken to Trump apparently since mid-December. But McCarthy has not yet made it clear how he's going to handle the prospect of having a member of his caucus who has said such outlandish and really frightening things on a number of subjects. And this is a challenge for the Republican Party going forward. To what extent does the party try to move past the Trump era? And Taylor Greene is a serviceable example of the Trump era in the current Congress. To what extent does the party try to move past that era, as McConnell clearly wants to? And to what extent does the party want to continue to make sure that there's a place for Trump supporters in the party, which seems to be McCarthy's approach? And it'll be fascinating in the next day or two to see how Kevin McCarthy handles his upcoming meeting with Marjorie Taylor Greene and how hard he pushes her to try to get back into line. So she's a marginally interesting person, but what it means for the future of one of our two major parties, I think, is much more interesting and much more important.
All right. China is the world's largest polluter. Can Biden and, sorry, I know we were correcting this, so John Kerry convinced China to cooperate on climate change? Why hasn't Al Gore been asked to participate by the government?
Okay. I can't speak to the second half of the question, but I think as far as Gore's participation. But once again, it is worth noting that Joe Biden has only been president for 13 days. So let's assume that he still has a ways to go and to putting together his policy teams on any number of subjects. But will Biden and Kerry be able to get China to abide by emission standards? And the answer is yes, but only to some degree. I think one of the things that President Xi has figured out very quickly during the Trump era is that China could look very good on a world stage at the United States' expense by demonstrating China's commitment to fighting climate change at the same time that Donald Trump was deriding it. Now that Trump is out of office, they don't have that foil anymore, and there is going to be increased pressure on them to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. China's argument, of course, is that emerging nations, of which they count themselves as one, has been polluting for a much shorter period of time than most established Western powers. And they feel like they're being asked to penalize themselves economically because of environmental transgressions that the United States and other Western powers have committed over many, many years before China's economy was in a position to make that kind of impact. Ultimately, China is going to be adhering to global climate change levels at a slower rate than more established than countries with more established economies will. And there is some fairness there because, as they point out, they are newer to this. So the debate, the challenge for Kerry and for Biden is to get China to accelerate its adherence to the greatest degree possible, which isn't going to be easy during a time when China now appears to be facing some economic headwinds of the type that they haven't seen in some time. But once again, to me, the most important thing about what John Kerry said about climate change as it related to China last week was not about climate change at all, but rather that Kerry was making it clear on Biden's behalf that we're not going to use greenhouse gases as a bargaining chip to allow China to avoid responsibility in economic insecurity and human rights measures.
Thank you. This next question is a bit long, so bear with me. What about the Belt and Road program of China? It seems as if China is establishing strong relations with countries around the world, South America and Africa and North Africa and Gulf states by loans and roads and infrastructure, opening Confucius institutes, encouraging the teaching of Mandarin, so soft power as well as monetary connections. Why is there not more focus on this Belt and Road expansion by the US and by the press? And what would be an appropriate US policy with which to deal with this? Sorry. And she says, apologies for so long.
No, it's a long question, but it's a very, very smart question. And the questioner is exactly right. China's so-called Belt and Road program, its commitment of hundreds of billions of dollars to economic and infrastructure projects in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, and elsewhere around the world, has been a tremendous example of geopolitical soft power. And it's very clear that China has established some very, very strong relationships with countries in these regions because of their willingness to fund these projects, while the United States has done some, but much less in comparison. The challenge for China, or I should say, I'll flip this around, the opportunity for the United States is that while China is providing a great deal of economic and infrastructure support, the terms of their loans are pretty onerous. And what many of these countries are finding is that they borrow an immense amount of money from China to invest in these projects. And then when they can't pay it back as quickly as they would have liked, particularly in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, that they end up in a very, very difficult position vis-a-vis their relationship with China. So is there an opportunity for the United States to do the same thing? Of course there is. And it's exactly what the United States did during the Cold War. That's ultimately the way the United States won the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The challenge for Biden and for his successors as well is that kind of large-scale investment costs money. And the United States Treasury doesn't have that kind of money available. This gets to a broader discussion between an authoritarian and democratic government. It's much easier for President Xi to say, let's spend $1 gazillion on infrastructure projects in other parts of the world than it is for President Biden, because she doesn't have to face the voters on this. But there's no question, and this is one of the reasons that Biden has so relentlessly been emphasizing the importance of multilateralism and working with our allies on diplomatic and security and human rights measures, is because Biden understands that while the United States cannot make the same level of economic commitment in these areas as China has, it needs to be able to find other ways to strengthen the relationships, either diplomatically or economically or on other fronts.
It sounds like you might have answered this a bit, but this questioner says, is there any chance Biden will revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
I think there's a very good chance. And the challenge for Biden is he has enjoyed for many years, well, he is for many years has been a very strong ally of organized labor. And much of organized labor is very hesitant to engage in large-scale trade agreements. It's worth noting that in 2016, not only did candidate Trump, but candidate Hillary Clinton both opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump walked back the United States' involvement in it upon taking office, which gave China a huge leg up in the Pacific Rim. Biden and his spokespeople through the campaign and through the transition have indicated on one hand their interest in strengthening trade relationships throughout the Pacific Rim, but Biden has been very quiet in what it's going to take to reinstitute a Trans-Pacific Partnership. He said he'd like to see changes in it, hasn't really said what those changes are. So on one hand, you have sort of a philosophical commitment for greater engagement in Asia, Jessica. On the other hand, you have tremendous domestic political pressure not to implement such a large-scale trade agreement. And there's already signs in other parts of the world that Biden is passing on opportunities, on trade opportunities, given those protectionist democratic sentiments. We saw just yesterday a bit of a flap between the United States and the United Arab Emirates on steel imports. And it's a relatively small matter in terms of dollars, but it does seem to be very indicative that while this Biden administration is going to change course from Trump on any number of matters, when it comes to trade policy, I don't know if the change is going to be that dramatic.
All right, hopping over to the school discussion. Why are the unions fighting so hard to keep schools closed in California and elsewhere when it is shown to be safe in about 2/3 of other states?
Well, yeah, the teachers' unions, like any organized labor movement, works to protect the safety of its members. And they make a very strong argument that even while the spread of the coronavirus in schools is not as significant as in other parts of society, that putting their members, teachers and other school employees at risk of the disease is something that puts an unfair burden on them. And so they want to see, among other things, they want to see full vaccinations for all teachers and all school employees before coming back to work. Governor Newsom, in some frustration a week or so ago, sort of vented at the unions, saying, if you think that everyone needs to be vaccinated before we open school again, let's be honest and say we're not going to be opening school again anytime soon. And what some of the voices who fought for a faster reopening have pointed out is that essential workers in many other quarters of society, by taking appropriate precautions, masks, social distancing, and so on, have returned to work, and argue that teachers ought to also. So it is a question of health and safety. Even if the children don't catch the virus, the adults who work with them can. And the balancing act between the health of teachers and other adult school employees on one hand versus the incredible loss to educational opportunities for children on the other is an extremely difficult problem. And like I said earlier, I don't know that either Biden or Newsom has an answer to it or will, unless they're willing to risk offending one of two very important constituencies, either teachers or parents.
Since you brought him into the question, we have several people asking about the recall effort against Gavin Newsom and what the likelihood of that is. So are you able to provide an update on that?
I recognize that while the majority of our participants do come from California, we do have a pretty large audience that comes from other states in the country as well. So we always spend a little bit less time on California politics and government for that, just for that reason. But that said, the potential recall of a governor is a tremendously important occurrence. As all of you know, we last had a governor recalled from office in 2003 when Gray Davis was removed and then replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. As I mentioned earlier, there's a new poll out this morning from the Institute of Government Studies at UC-Berkeley. The LA Times ran a story on it just this morning, showing that Gavin Newsom's favorability ratings, his poll numbers, have dropped precipitously since they last polled in the fall. Some of that is because of the governor's decision to attend a birthday dinner for a friend of his, a very well-connected lobbyist, at a very fancy restaurant in the Napa Valley without engaging in social distancing. But a lot of it is simply the growing frustration among many Californians toward the ongoing virus and the restrictions it imposes. I'll offer this, quickly, and then perhaps, Jessica, we can talk about the recall at greater length in a future program. Qualifying a recall for the ballot is an entirely different exercise than winning a recall election. To get the recall on the ballot, to get to a point where Californians would vote this summer or this fall on whether or not to remove Gavin Newsom from office, whether that recall qualifies is entirely a matter of money. It's entirely a matter of dollars and cents. In 2003, Congressman Darrell Issa, the wealthiest member of Congress who wanted to be governor himself, wrote a really big check to qualify the recall. And even though Issa dropped out and Schwarzenegger was elected instead, if Issa hadn't contributed a couple $1 million to the qualification of the recall, it wouldn't have happened. Right now, we've seen several fairly large-scale donors give money to the recall effort, but no one's written a check of the size that Issa did. And so it's pretty simple. If the proponents of the Newsom recall can find one or a very small number of very large-scale donors to give very large amounts of money, then the recall will qualify. If they can't, then it won't. If the recall does end up on the ballot, then I think Newsom is in some trouble. The new poll numbers show that voters who had been very, very supportive of him early in the pandemic are much more equivocal and much more skeptical now. And although 2 Republicans have announced their candidacies for governor should the recall qualify, the businessman John Cox, who ran against Newsom in 2018, and Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego, have both indicated they'll run in the recall if it qualifies, in 2022 if it doesn't. My own opinion is that Newsom's greatest threat almost certainly comes not from the right, but from the left. So for those of you who have long memories and remember the 2003 recall election, there were 130 candidates on the ballot. And as hard as Gray Davis and his advisors worked to keep any other Democrats from running, Davis's own lieutenant governor, Cruz Bustamante, a fellow Democrat, did announce for governor in that election. And while Bustamante never really did have a serious chance of winning, his entry into the race made it much harder for Davis to argue that the recall was a purely partisan exercise. Newsom's people are working equally hard to make sure another Democrat doesn't enter the race, but that's not going to be easy. So 2 things to watch for. 1, can the recall supporters find someone to write a really big check and make a really big donation to put it on the ballot? And if they do, does another Democrat or other Democrats get in the race? Because that's when it becomes a much more serious challenge for Newsom.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. You took us right to the end of the hour. So great timing. I know we have a lot more to talk about. Well, hopefully we'll see everybody next Tuesday. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you. Thanks.
Dan, thank you again for such an informative discussion. We can't do this without you. And we're looking forward to next Tuesday for more. So what do we decide some of those topics might be?
Well, when we asked the group last week for the international topics they wanted to talk about, China came in first, but Russia was second. So we'll definitely talk about Russia. 1 week from today is also the beginning of the Trump impeachment trial. So my guess is we'll talk about that. And then beyond that, Jessica and Claire and I will take a day or two to figure out what our third topic is. But we'll talk impeachment, we'll talk Russia, and my guess is we'll probably also end up, Kim, talking about the vaccination rollout and where that's going well and where it's going poorly. So as an early indicator for next week, my guess is those will be our three topics.
Thank you, as always. Just a reminder to our audience, your generosity in providing donation also supports our live stream outreach to our public high school students. Our next high school program on the Digital Learning Lab at the University of California at Irvine will convene on February 12th at 11 a.m. So please help us keep these live streams going by texting the name Schnur to the number on the screen. Also, an update on our February 19th Bill Gates program. He will be joined in conversation with climate change activist, philanthropist, and award-winning actor Don Cheadle. So be sure to register today. Also, the Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, as you know, is on Tuesdays. We offer our members an exclusive opportunity to chat with Professor Schnur in a virtual gathering after the live stream, which we're doing today. We do that every other week. So if you're not a member and would like to participate in more close conversation with Dan, please register and become a member today. Another member benefit that you may not be aware of is the chance to view notable award-worthy films in our foreign film series. So again, please go to our website at lawacth.org, register for upcoming programs, become a member, renew your membership, or make a donation. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much.